Today, I go a little mad chatting about the dodgy continuity of one of my favorite horror franchises. Long before the character was the subject of a hit A&E television series called Bates Motel, Norman Bates was introduced in Psycho, the classic horror novel by Robert Bloch, which was very loosely based on the exploits of Wisconsin madman Ed Gein. That novel would eventually be adapted by legendary filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock and screenwriter Joseph Stefano for the classic 1960 film of the same name. This film would spawn an unlikely franchise when, 22 years later, Hitchcock acolyte Richard Franklin would direct Psycho 2, an outstanding sequel which found eponymous Psycho Norman Bates released from the sanitarium and out into the real world. The movie's big surprise wasn't that Norman was said to be fully rehabilitated and released, but that he was actually the victim in the film. That's right, Norman's the hero and is targeted by a vengeful relative of a past victim who intends to drive him crazy again and get him recommitted. The film's tragic ending reveals that, unfortunately, they were successful, as Norman is as loony as ever by the film's final frames. These events were followed up by Psycho 3, which found Norman back to his old murderous ways. Well, keep in mind, Norman isn't a murderer exactly. Mother is. Norman is actually a tragic, oddly likable figure. If it weren't for the whole believing he's his mother and offing people while dressed in her clothes thing, he might be the guy you wouldn't mind chatting with terribly about, I don't know, taxidermy or something. Anyway, after racking up a body count that'd do a mid-80s slasher film proud, Norman is led away by the cops at the end of Psycho 3, being assured by the sheriff that he is never going to get out again. But at least I'll be free, Norman notes, having rejected Mother and exorcised his own demons in the film's final act. And then we have Psycho 4 at the beginning. Look, it's an unpopular opinion, but I love this film. I even like it more than the third installment. Far more. The setup is simple enough. Norman Bates is free, married, expecting a child, and makes a call into a radio station under the name Ed, where he chats about the events that led him to becoming a murderer in the first place that we've known throughout the entire franchise. It's this backstory that makes up the bulk of the film, with E.T.'s Henry Thomas playing young Norman and a marvelously batshit Olivia Hussey playing a lively Mother Bates. It's this period, what with its teenage Norman and his mother, that's retold in a completely different and contemporary fashion in A&E's Bates Motel. But anyway, back to Psycho 4, it's ultimately revealed in this film that while Norman is fully sane, he's still contemplating murder, not as Mother, but as himself. You see, he's terrified about the child his wife is about to bring into the world, and that it'll be as damaged and evil as he once was and may still be, and he wants to end the pregnancy in the most violent way possible. It's dark stuff, but amazingly, the film has a powerful, redemptive ending and provides a type of closure that few horror icons have ever managed to enjoy. But wait a damn second, how, oh how, is Norman friggin' Bates free and just roaming about in Psycho 4 just half a decade after he was caught murdering again in Psycho 3? He was told, one would imagine rightfully so, that he would never again be free, and here he is, free, again. But, okay, here's the thing. Psycho 4 was written by Joseph Stefano, the same screenwriter who penned the original 1960 Hitchcock flick, and apparently he had no interest in writing a sequel that accounted for the previous two films. No sir, nope. Psycho 4 The Beginning was likely only looked at by Stefano as Psycho The Beginning. No 4 involved. A direct sequel-prequel to the classic Hitchcock film that wouldn't bother with those other pesky follow-ups. If one takes that into account, then, well, I suppose it makes sense. If the continuity only accounts for Psycho and Psycho 4, then yeah, one can imagine that Norman was freed sometime after the events of Psycho, got married, lived a relatively normal life until his wife got pregnant, and the events of the newer film take place. Except, there are lines in Psycho 4 that seem to directly acknowledge the events of Psychos 2 and 3. Norman says,
after the last murder 4 years ago. Murders, plural.
Now, it'd be more like 8 years ago, given the film's timeline. 3 only takes place shortly after Part 2, which is set in 1982, while Psycho 4 was released and presumably set in 1990. Norman also notes,
I've killed damn near a dozen human beings.
Well, let's think about this. If we're only taking Psycho into account, well, there's Marion Crane, Arbogast, Norman's mother and her lover, and 2 other unnamed missing persons mentioned in the film's penultimate scene. That's 6 people. Half a dozen. Not damn near a full dozen, no. But when we factor in all the poor people Norman whacks in 2 and 3, well, that is damn near a dozen. And plus, damn it, the movie is called Psycho 4. Psycho 4. You can't have a 4 without having a 2 and a 3. You just can't. So you know what? They count, all those films, which means somehow, some way, Norman was freed yet again after the events of Psycho 3. So what's the explanation for that? A mentally ill murderer is put away, rehabilitated, released 22 years later, is caught killing again, and is at some point released yet again. Are the authorities here just completely inept, or is Norman just that damn charming? Or, what if, now bear with me, Norman wasn't actually convicted of murder directly after the events of Psycho 3? Because, let's take a look at the body count preceding Part 4. We have Mrs. Spool, the true murderer of Psycho 2. Norman kills her, stuffs her, puts her in Mother's chair at the end of that second film. Then in Part 3, we have poor Red, a tragic young woman who runs afoul of Norman. Then there's a young lady from a visiting pack of football enthusiasts in town for a game. There's Dwayne Duke, an all-around sleazebag that Norman kills for attempting to blackmail him with Mother's corpse. And then, but then, poor Maureen, a tragic ex-nun and would-be love interest for Norman who dies in an accident in the film's finale. So, would these murders be counted against Norman? Well, Mrs. Spool was murder. She was a murderer, easily proven. Maybe the case was made that Norman killed her in self-defense, and this triggered his madness yet again. Red, the football fan, and Duke all went into the swamp, Norman's old dumping ground. Now, yeah, sure, the swamp would likely have been dragged for the umpteenth time in the franchise's history in the wake of Norman being put away yet again, but we don't know that for certain. We don't. So maybe the cops never knew about those bodies. And finally, poor Maureen. She died an accidental death, not Norman's fault at all. So what would be held against him? Well, he dressed up as Mother again and threatened poor Tracy Venable, the reporter who had investigated Norman and Mrs. Spool's disappearance. That's it, possibly. So instead of all these murders being held against Norman, instead of people believing that he was well and truly a psycho killer yet again, maybe the events of Part 3 were viewed as a mere setback for Norman. Maybe he would have only gotten, I don't know, a couple of years in a sanitarium as a result. Who knows? Who knows? But there is a moment in 4 where Norman talks about the previous murders and how he was treated with
The same rough therapy. The same phased re-entry into society.
leading one to think that, yeah, we're to believe he was found to be crazy and murderous after the events of 3 and was let loose yet again. And that's a simple case of the courts going just a little mad, wouldn't you say? So, I don't know, have you seen these films? Do you agree with me? How do you make sense of some of these leaps one needs to take in order for the continuity to make sense between all of these films? Let us know. As with always, use the comments section below. Be sure to like, subscribe, share. Find us on Facebook. Scream at us on Twitter. That's @ScreamAddicts, and I am @Jinx1981. Until next time, fellow Scream Addicts, thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.